think you ought to tell it this year we went to China.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, go ahead.
Here, let me give him this.
Don't give him anything.
Remind him.
And the camera's not going to pick that up.
Certainly is.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Romondo Davis. This is Saturday, July the 31st, 1993, the year of the great Mississippi River flood, including other rivers, of course. Romondo has asked me to record some of my thoughts. I have made no notes. I'm just talking ad lib. I was born on August the 23rd, 1920. That makes me, in about 3 weeks, 73 years old. I was born on a flat in, I think, the 4800 block of Labadie in North St. Louis, a few blocks east of Kings Highway. Those were the days when many babies were born in the home. When my mother went into labor, my dad called the doctor, who came right over. And after the doctor had been in the bedroom for a few minutes, he told my dad that he might be able to save the baby, but there was no way of saving the mother. He went back into the bedroom. A few minutes later, came out and told my dad there was no possible chance of saving the mother or the baby. He went back in the bedroom, and a few minutes later came out and said that a baby boy had been born. I didn't mention that over in the corner of my mother's bedroom, there was a woman seated, reading, praying, and practicing her Christian Science. The doctor, representing the medical profession, had completely given up on the situation. He told my dad there was no chance of saving the baby or the mother. The baby and the mother came through beautifully because of this woman who was practicing her Christian Science. When I was 2 years old, we moved to Webster Groves at 760 East Big Bend, where I spent several years before starting kindergarten at the Lockwood School. Of course, in the meantime, or 14 months after I was born, my sister Mary Jane was born, and my mother, incidentally, had no problems with the birth. I went to Lockwood School for kindergarten, and just kindergarten at Lockwood School, and then we moved, and I went to Bristol for 4 years. Then we moved back to where we lived originally in Webster Groves, and I finished my grade school at Lockwood School. I went to junior high school, senior high school, and that's the extent of my formal education. I spent almost 4 years in the Navy, a year and a half at Lambert Field, right here in St. Louis, but that was too good to last at that Naval Country Club, they called it. And I was sent to sea aboard a big seaplane tender called the USS Currituck, where I was log room yeoman. We put the ship in commission in Philadelphia, sailed her down through the Panama Canal to the South Pacific, where I spent another year or so. I had many interesting experiences aboard that ship in the Navy, one of which, as I mentioned, was going through the Panama Canal. We saw some action. On the type of ship that I served on, we tended a squadron of 18 PBM flying boats, or naval, mostly observation boats. Ships, I should say. I'll never live that one down. And after a year and a half overseas, we came home to San Francisco, where I immediately went on leave for 30 days, went back to the ship for 30 days, and on the 11th of March, 1946, I was discharged. One of the greatest days of my life was getting out of the Navy. Not that I disliked the Navy, I just disliked being away from home. When I was 12 years old, I joined the Boy Scouts, which, next to my family life, was probably the greatest experience, most beneficial experience of my life. Except for my dad, I learned more from my scoutmaster and being in the Scouts than I did from any other source. In school, I kind of specialized in music. Started out on the trumpet in grade school, went to junior high school and played the baritone for a year or so, and then played the E-flat bass and then the double B-flat bass. As my sons came along later, they too started on the trumpet and went to those same bass instruments that I played in high school.
Singing.
I have done quite a bit of singing in my life. I was in the a cappella choir at high school for 3 years, benefited greatly from my experience working with Esther Replogle, who, next to my dad and my Scoutmaster Doc Colgate, did more for me than anybody else, until, of course, the time that I got married. Later on, about a year after I graduated from high school, I organized a trio, vocal trio, and eventually that developed into a quartet. During the war, of course, we all went our separate ways in the various branches of the service, and when we got back home, we reorganized our quartet and sang together for some 25 or 30 years. And I don't mind saying it, but we were a pretty doggone good sounding organization. And apparently other people did too, because once or twice every week, almost every week, we had some program to sing for, whether it was a banquet or a radio performance or whatever. On November the 1st, 1947, I married Marjorie Jean Schiffman, very nice young lady, pretty young lady, and we had 3 girls, a boy, a girl, and a boy, and that makes 6 kids, and they have produced for us some 12 and a half youngsters. Daughter Mary has a baby on the way, and that will make 13 babies. And we love them all very much. They're all very outstanding kids. Hobby-wise, besides my music, I have a woodworking shop in the basement, and I think I have a bit of an unusual hobby, and that is blacksmithing. I have a blacksmith shop in my backyard that I like very much to work in. I've been active in the Lions Club in Webster Groves for some 53 years. My dad was a charter member of the Webster Groves Lions Club, and his experiences in that club meant so much to him that when I became 21, old enough to join, I did join and have been very active ever since. I've been in our club longer than anybody else. That's 53 years. I have 53 years perfect attendance. I have what is known as a Melvin Jones Fellow Award. I am a life member of the Webster Groves Lions Club and Lions International. About 1949, I started giving blood to the Red Cross when they introduced their mobile blood unit here in Webster Groves. And after giving 214 units, or 2 units shy of 27 gallons, I had to go on a medication which the Red Cross would not accept. But if I ever get off that medication, I will certainly go back to giving blood. I served as disaster chairman for the Webster Groves chapter of the Red Cross for 6 or 8 years. Member of the board of directors, chairman of the board of directors. When the Webster Groves chapter became a part of the newly formed St. Louis Bi-State chapter, I was made disaster chairman for the South County region, which is everything south of Highway 40. That included, of course, the flooding Merrimack and other rivers in South County, tornadoes, fires, and other forms of disaster. Right now I'm not active in the Red Cross in any capacity, but I wish I were.
Tools.
I mentioned that I have a workshop in the basement and a blacksmith shop. I have quite a few tools, power tools, hand tools, yard tools, and that about takes care of that.
Talk about how you started to build that collection.
I'm just going to start that. 3 or 4 years ago, I became interested in the sculpture works of Frederick Remington. And for our Christmas several years ago, Margene bought for me a statue of the Bronco Buster. That started me on a collection. She has given me, I have now 6 statues. I like them all very much, and I intend to increase my collection. It makes a very interesting hobby, and it's good to have these works of this great artist.
I was referring to your collection of tools, how you got interested in how you became so handy when your dad really wasn't.
Well, that's right. My dad, with all due respect to him, I don't think knew the difference between a hammer and a screwdriver and a pair of pliers, but some men are like that. They have their other fortes. And until I got married, I didn't have any tools and know how to use them. After I got married, I bought a set of pliers and a hammer and a couple screwdrivers, and later on an electric drill. And then I went into all kinds of power tools, table saws, radial saws. I have some 14 power saws, I think, right now. Wood lathe, drill press, metal cutting tools, bandsaw and chop saw, and still enlarging my assortment of tools.
What do you do with them?
Huh?
Okay, talk about some of the things you do, not just here, but for other people with the tools.
Oh, people ask me occasionally to make things for them, or to repair things for them, or make parts for furniture or jewelry, or something that I can make in my blacksmith shop. Lucy Reed asked me to make her some backyard candle storm lamps. I made her a set of 6 of those. We'll probably make some more of them. I think she would like to have a few more. And somebody has a piece of metal that's bent, I can straighten that out, or make candle holders and belt buckles and fireplace pokers, and nothing real elaborate, but triangles, clang, 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 clang. And I'm gradually improving my skills in that respect. A few years ago, Margene and I got into tennis, and we play that 2 or 3 or 4 times a week, depending on the weather and depending on how many mornings she plays with the kids, as she calls them, or her lady friends. Kids, she calls them.
Is there anything
Girls.
different about the way you play with each other compared to how 2 real competitors would play? Do you try to hit it to each other?
Well, most of ours is just hitting the ball back and forth across the net if we can get it across the net. But occasionally we play a game. We don't play any doubles. And we started a few nights ago to take tennis lessons at the Webster City Park, and they didn't have enough people, so that's been postponed until the fall.
The church and Meals on Wheels you belong to.
Margene and I belong to the Webster Groves Christian Church. We belonged there for some 25 years, I suppose, and then because of the kids and getting out to church Sunday school and my singing in the choir, Margene singing in the choir, involved a lot of getting ready on Sunday morning and a lot of driving. So we transferred our membership to the local Webster Groves Methodist Church, where we belonged for some 20 years. And then a few years ago, we went back to the Christian Church. Margene, for the past 2 years, has been a deacon in the church, has 1 more year to serve. When I rejoined the church, I joined the choir, in which I had sung all the time when we belonged before, but my voice by that time was pretty well worn out, and I couldn't sing very long without getting so hoarse that I had to stop singing. This past January, I had a throat operation, which greatly improved my voice and my singing, but it still gets tired, and I'm hoarse today because I've been working in the yard, and whenever I exert myself like that, I somehow get hoarse. I have a nice collection of smoking pipes. I have some 75 of them. And usually when we take a trip, I like to buy a pipe as a token of our having been in a certain city. Like a few years ago we went to Europe and I bought a pipe in Germany. And other places. As far as travel is concerned, we love very much to attend the elder hostels. We've been to some 11 or 12 of them. We have another one planned for November of this year. We have been on several trips. I mentioned the trip to Europe. This past spring we went to China for 2 weeks in Hong Kong. That was a very interesting experience. We've been 3 times to Honolulu, twice when Monty and Deb lived there and had their 2 kids, and I was there once in the Navy, just passing through on one Liberty, and Mom was there with Carol and her mother on a trip on their own. We plan to go to Alaska in September of this year, and maybe to Palm Springs, California during Christmas week. And next year we want to go to Russia sometime through the Panama Canal, which I've been through in the Navy, but I'd sure like to see it again. We want to go to, Mom wants to go to Ireland. I'm not too happy about going to any area where there is apt to be an uprising and shooting and killing and so forth, like Ireland or Israel or any of the Near East countries. Travel. Did I mention, oh yeah, Russia?
Talk a little more specifically about China, and one about going to
Russia.
the place you had visited in the Navy in China.
Oh, when I was in the Navy, right after the war ended, the armistice was signed, of course, but the American government wasn't certain that the various Japanese commanders in China and Korea, they were so fanatical, the Americans thought that maybe there were some of them that weren't going to accept the surrender and continue to fight. So the Navy sent a pretty good-sized battle fleet, soldiers, Marines, into various ports along the China Sea, Korea, Shanghai, Incheon, Korea, Shanghai, Tsingtao. And our ship was part of this battle fleet because they used our PBMs to fly out somewhere, I don't know where, and pick up the mail for this fleet, bring it back and disseminate it to the various ships. So that enabled me, after spending all my life up to that time wishing I could someday go to China. I was in the Philippines and was so close to China, and I thought I would never get to see it, even though I was that close. But this trip we took this past spring, to me, was very discouraging. The poverty is very rampant. People appear to be happy, but they don't know any better. They don't know what they don't have. They live in hovels, shacks. They dress fairly well, but they just don't know there is a better life. The food we had was terrible. It was very interesting, of course, to visit more of Shanghai than I was able to see when I was in the Navy. We went to Beijing and saw Tiananmen Square and the Forbidden City and other points of interest. We went to the Great Wall, which is one of the great experiences of my life. We went to Chiang, where some 17 or 20 years ago they accidentally uncovered the terracotta warriors. An ancient emperor of China, forgotten who he is, was very erratic, and he wanted to bury his entire army alive. And his lieutenants, his assistants, talked him out of that idea and told him, or suggested to him, that they make life-size terracotta statues. And not very many years ago, I say 17 or 20 years ago, there was a farmer near Chiang who was poking around in the ground with a metal rod, trying to find a place where he could put a well. And he got a few feet down, and he felt resistance to the rod, and he dug down and he found a few of these soldiers. They were all lined in ranks. All the expressions and all the faces were different. They all had swords or lances. They were in parade file.
Horses.
They had horses. They were life-size. And the government, of course, stepped in and took this thing over, and they found, I think, so far 6,000, and they're still digging. And while we were there, and I don't know if you can see it, but we got this little model of one of the soldiers, and that's the memory we have of this tremendous operation. They have built big Quonset-type buildings over these areas. Each one would house, I don't know, 2 or 3 football fields, and so far they have 3 of these, and they're going to build more. The archaeologists are still digging, and that was a very interesting experience. From there we went to Canton, I believe, and got on a train and rode to Kowloon, which is about half of Hong Kong. We went to Hong Kong, which was a different world entirely, prosperity all around, plenty of food, good food, beautiful buildings, adequate housing for the people, as compared to the shacks and hovels the people on the mainland lived in. And overall, I think the good parts of our trip overshadowed the bad parts, but I certainly don't want to go again. I mentioned the food was so bad that I could hardly eat it. I missed more than half my meals, and some of the meals I had consisted just of soup.
Childhood, the harsh childhood, and your homes you lived in, the houses you
Yes, I mentioned we moved on to Big Bend when I was 2, and when I was 6, we moved into a house at the corner of Woodlawn and South Rock Hill. My dad was in the real estate business well, ever since I was born. Oh no, he was teaching school in North St. Louis when I was born, and weekends and holidays he would sell real estate. His mother sold real estate in southern Michigan where he grew up, and he had a little bit of a background in that field. His dad died when he was quite young, and his mother had to support my dad and his 4 brothers, 3 or 4 brothers. So evenings and holidays and Saturdays, my dad sold real estate besides teaching school. And as he put it, when the tail gets to wagging the dog, you cut the dog off. So he quit teaching school in the real estate business, and he was asked to come to the Old Orchard State Bank, a little bank over on North Old Orchard at Big Bend Road, to manage their small real estate department, which certainly grew after he took over. But on his own, he did quite a bit of speculating. He built 126 houses in the Webster Groves and in Byron's. And so when we moved from our first house on Big Bend to this house on Woodlawn and Rock Hill, that was the first new house, one of his new houses that we moved into. Lived there a couple of years and moved 3 or 4 blocks south on South Rock Hill, right at the Frisco Tracks. Lived there for a few years and moved 2 blocks west into a nice house at the south end of Sherwood Drive. There he had horses for himself, and he had a pony, one for my sister and one for me. I would much rather ride his horse than ride my pony, but that's the way it was. One of my jobs, besides working the pitchfork and handling the cleaning up of the stalls, we had a small garage built in the backyard to house these horses and a little corral off of that. But one of my jobs with these horses was to ride them in about a mile or so to the blacksmith shop at the corner of North Gore and Marshall Place. And it was there that I acquired an interest in blacksmithing. Of course, horseshoeing and blacksmithing technically are 2 different fields. The blacksmith, or the shoer, is called a farrier, and the blacksmiths, some of them don't do any, or many of them don't do any horseshoeing, and some farriers don't do any blacksmithing, but they both use the forge, anvil, tongs, hammers, and so forth. Well, that interest in blacksmithing that I acquired by watching this man shape the pieces of iron into a shoe and then shape them to fit the horse's hoof was latent in the back of my mind for many years, until about maybe 10 years ago I saw in a junior college continuing education bulletin a notice of a class uh, put on by the Florissant Valley Junior College at a blacksmith shop up in Spanish Lake. So I decided I would take this course. And that got me started in active blacksmithing. I acquired an anvil, got my second anvil, got a forge, hammers, tongs, other blacksmithing tools. And I've been to an advanced course in blacksmithing up there. I've been to quite a few blacksmithing seminars around St. Louis, in and around St. Louis, usually over at the Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. And quite a few of the elder hostels we've attended around the country we've gone to because they had a course in blacksmithing.
Runaway horse.
Oh, the runaway horse. I had an extreme interest in horses when we had them on Sherwood. And that was back in the days when they dug house foundations, and they were building many houses in those days with a team and a slip, they called it. A team of horses would pull this slip along and scoop up a load of dirt, and then they'd bring it up to the ground level and dump it. And somehow, if they were going to transport this dirt, they would put it in a great big wagon. They didn't have trucks, dump trucks in those days. And the contractor that dug these foundations, I'm talking about 2 or 3 of them on Sherwood Drive, just a few hundred feet from where we lived. I don't think he used the wagon, but he had this big team of draft horses. And I happened to be up on Baker Avenue, which is a poured concrete street, 3 or 4 houses west of Frisco, the Frisco station, visiting a friend up there. And I had my pony up there, and I was just leaving there to go home, going west on Baker, when I heard this rumble of this team of horses pulling this wagon, and the wagon had rubber tires on it, as they call rubber, steel tires as they called them, about 4 inches wide, for preventing sinking in the mud that they had to pull through. And these horses were just out of their minds. Their eyes were very big, their nostrils were big, they were stampeding, they were crazy. Well, the house we lived in on Sherwood had a beautiful yard, about 3/4 of an acre, and some 50 or 60 big oak trees in it. And as an incentive to get me to rake those oak leaves several times every fall, my dad would dangle in front of me the possibility or the assurance of taking me to what they used to call the Wild West shows in those days, or shows like Buffalo Bill used to put on. They were just glorified rodeos, but I loved them, and I'd even rake 3/4 of an acre of leaves just to get to go. So I had been to quite a few of these shows down at the arena, maybe some of the later ones with the arena, but Missouri Stables, I think they were held at originally, down near the arena. And I had seen quite a bit of Roman riding. That's where the cowboy gets up on 2 horses side by side, holds the reins, and stands 1 foot on each horse and controls them and rides them around in circles and so forth. And that always interested me. Well, here I was on this pony, and I saw this runaway team coming toward me. I turned the pony around, stood up in the saddle, craziest thing I've ever done in my whole life. And I jumped over onto these horses and rode them Roman fashion, got the reins, and I worked like this, and I finally stopped them. Great big metal shoes on these horses, metal tires on the wagon, metal shoes on my pony, on a concrete street. Now that's crazy. Just that in itself is crazy, but it was all part of a day's play for me.
What about your cars, all your cars, station wagons, hearse?
Well, I grew up during the Depression, of course, and I didn't have a car in high school or even after high school. About 1939, when I was about 19 years old, I got my first car, a used car, of course. And that was shortly before we got into the war, when they weren't making cars. And I had about a 37 Plymouth, so I went into the Navy, or into the overseas. And I always loved station wagons. As a lad, I used to go into Reese Meyer's Ford agency up on Lockwood, right next to the old Ozark Theater. I was maybe 12, 13 years old, and that was back when the Model A was just putting out this new idea, the station wagon. And from then on, I always wanted to own a station wagon. I would go up to Reese Meyer and just sit there and dream of owning one. And then when I got out of the service, everybody, I mean everybody, was putting in their names with all the auto agencies for a new car. I put mine in. And then on the glorious day, April the 1st, April Fool's Day of 1947, and I'd had a car in the meantime since I got back, but they called me from a Ford agency in Maplewood, Roper Dance, and said that they had my new station wagon and I could come in and get it. Of course, I had to take the money in with me, naturally. So I got the station wagon, and that was followed by 2 or 3 or 4 more station wagons. And we went through a period when the boys, Romondo and Jonathan, were in the Scouts. And I got a 1954 black Cadillac hearse, combination hearse and ambulance. And that was our second car. And we'd take the kids to school, we'd haul their band instruments around, we'd use it for paper drives, we used it for camping, whether it was a family camping or scout camping. And it had many uses, and we were pretty well known around town for our hearse, which was just one of 3 that we had later on. We were known to the kids in high school. No, that was station wagon we had with a picture of the Piasso bird on it. It was known as the Dragon Wagon. But we did find many good uses for the hearses. I mentioned the Piasso bird. And I also mentioned our very outstanding scoutmaster. One summer, when we went to Camp Irondale, where I spent, I don't know how many years, 4 or 5 years, I guess, and joined Order of the Arrow, our scoutmaster checked a book out of the Webster Groves Public Library called The Legends of the Piasso Country by Georgia McAdams Clifford. McAdams Highway, running north out of Alton, Illinois, was her dad, named after her dad. Of course, the lead story in this Legends of the Piasso Country was the legend of the Piasso bird. And Doc took this book to camp to read that story to us around the campfire one night. And I acquired quite an interest in not only in the story, but in the bird itself. And at the heading of this story, there was a little cut about 1.5 inches long of this bird. And if we had the picture of it, we could see it. When I was in the Navy at Lambert Field, I was editor of the station newspaper, and I had in my office a real fine black lad who was an artist, and that was his job in the Navy, is to do the artwork for the paper, and he did some other sign lettering for the base. But I took this book with a little cut in it to Spencer T. Banks. You want to get that picture, Margie?
We'll put it in later.
And from that little picture, he made a big pen and ink drawing, very minute pen and ink lines, about so big, of this little picture. And for many, many years, I would take that picture around to school classrooms, Boy Scout, Cub Scout troops, Girl Scouts, Father and Sons Indian guides, and tell the story of the Piasso bird. And I've made a lot of people around this area aware of the so-called existence of the Piasso bird. It's so close to us here that there aren't very many people actually that know about it.
Where is it?
The bird was painted on the bluffs just now north of what is now Alton, the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, by the Indians. They had no real paint. They used roots and clay, made their dyes, and painted this way up on the bluff. Nobody knew how they got up there, how they could paint, or how the paints would last so long. And the legend tells about how the Piasaw bird was killed eventually. And when it was killed, the Indians painted this thing on the bluff, and every time they'd go up or down the Mississippi in a canoe, they would fire an arrow up at it. And later on, a professor from Shortlift College, which was then over, I think, in Alton, found piles of arrowheads under a cliff. So that's the only evidence, well, it's not the only evidence that we had that the bird existed. They did paint it there, we know that. And then about I've forgotten my dates, late 1800s, that bird, that beautiful, ugly picture, was blasted away, or the cliff was, to make way for, I think, a railroad. The natives up at Alton painted it back up there, about 20 feet up off the ground level, which was nowhere near as high as the Indians did. And that was blown away to make way for a railroad or the highway. I've forgotten which order it was. And since then, the Boy Scouts, I think it is, or the Chamber of Commerce, have made a very poor reproduction of the bird, which is still up there. And every time I pass the thing, I want to cry, because it is such a terrible job that it is going to last. I think it's on steel this time.
Tell about Kathy, Karen, Carol.
Okay, the kids we've had. Our first daughter, first youngster, is Catherine, who was named after my mother, who spelled her name Cathryn, Catherine. A year and 5 days later, a second baby girl came along, and we changed, or took the TH out of Catherine, and that left the name for the second daughter, Karen, Caryn. And then maybe 2 years later, number 3 daughter came along. We changed the N in Karen to an L, and that made Carol. Catherine, Karen, and Carol, all spelled in a similar manner. And then eventually our first son came along, Romondo E Davis. And I was sure glad to see him born into the family, because I was able to do things with him that I couldn't do with the daughters, even though we did a lot of things with the daughters, our Girl Scouts and the music and so forth. I could get into the Boy Scouts with him and refresh my memory of the days when I was a scout myself. I was a counselor, merit badge counselor for the 4 citizenship merit badge, I think 3 of which were required for the Eagle badge. So I had many, many young boys come to me, some I think 2,800 merit badges that I passed. And after Romondo, we had Mary, and then Jonathan, our second boy, and that finished off our kids. Catherine has 3 youngsters, 2 boys and a girl. Karen has 1 boy. Carol has a boy and a girl. Monty has 2 boys and a girl. Mary has 3 girls and a boy, and another one coming along sometime around this Christmas of '93. Monty, I mentioned Jonathan. Well, I was very proud of the fact that when my oldest son graduated from high school, having had a grandfather and a dad who both served in the United States Navy, he couldn't wait to join himself and serve proudly in the Navy for 4 years. That meant very much to me. So much that I went down and watched him be inducted into the Navy, which none of the other dads did, as I recall. Jonathan, our youngest, is not married. He's up in Belvedere, Illinois. He has a tremendous love of the outdoors. College major was recreation and park management, and he wanted to get into work that involved the out of doors. He is superintendent of parks up at Belvedere and Illinois, and likes it very much.
How were you named Romondo? Why?
How was I named Romondo? Well, I mentioned that my dad was one of 5 boys up in southern Michigan. When he was growing up, there was an old man in the town of Albion, Michigan, where he grew up. That's redundant. And my dad had the greatest respect for this old man. And he vowed when he was old enough to realize that someday he might have a boy of his own, he vowed that he was going to name one of his sons after one of the sons of this fine old man. Well, it so happened that the names of the old man's 5 sons were real far out. And about the only one that my dad could pronounce was Romondo. I keep referring to my dad. My great-grandfather, I should have said all along, he named one of his sons Romondo, who was the son was my grandfather and the father of my dad. An uncle, or had an uncle by the name of Romondo. Uncle Mon named one of his sons Romondo. He never used the name, he always went by R. Bud Davis. But my dad liked the name that his dad had and his brother had, so he called me Romondo, and we called our oldest son Romondo, and he named his first son Romondo. So there have been a lot of Romondo Davises in the family, and maybe there'll be more, we don't know. I had a good friend, the chief yeoman up at Lambert Field, an Italian lad who had served, I guess, a hitch or 4 years before the war started and was still in when I was up at Lambert Field. And he told me that he had seen several fleets, Italian fleets, in various ports in Italy, where each ship had the first name of Romondo. That's the first time I'd ever heard of it. But I have since been told by so-called authorities, I guess, that Romondo is Raymond, or Spanish and Italian for Raymond. Of course, there is Raimundo and other various forms of the name Romondo, but I had never heard of it outside of our family. Huh?
Go ahead.
One of my many interesting experiences in the Boy Scouts, it was the night in November of 1936 when Franklin Roosevelt defeated Alf Landon. Aunt Addie gave a little going away party for Norshall, can't think of his last name, who was in our little clique of friends that belonged to the troop. We called him Maggots. And then Eddie, during the course of the evening, while Uncle Al was trying to get the election returns over the radio, served us each a bottle of Pepsi-Cola. Somebody, one of the boys, as boys will, blew into the top of the bottle that made a whistle. Then another boy blew in his bottle, and that made the first 2 notes of taps. I got the idea of tuning 2 more bottles to make a tonic chord, and we worked up a little 4-piece bottle band, as we call it, playing bugle calls. And our scoutmaster thought that was so unique that our next court of honor, he had us play those bugle calls as part of the entertainment. Well, then I got the idea of filling in this chord with an octave. And we had 4 boys playing the melody, 2 bottles each, that made 8 bottles. And then we had 3 boys playing chords on 12-ounce bottles. And I obtained 4 great big, I don't know what their contents size was, Pepsi bottles, boom, 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 boom. I had a special stand, And with those bass notes, the chords, and the four boys playing the melody, we had a very unique bottle band. And we went all over the St. Louis area playing for various groups. And we played everything from little German band numbers, Dr. Lieber Augustine, to the finale of the William Tell Overture, which was quite an undertaking. Well, as the kids came along, and we had 8 people in the family eventually, we worked up our own family bottle band, and we played for church, and we played for outside programs, and that was a lot of fun. PTA shows up at school, Avery. And we also, during the time we were at the Methodist Church up on Bompart, the Connie Nagy family, Connie and his sister Gwen, donated to the church a very expensive set of Schumeric handbells, and I was asked to direct the handbell choir. And not only did we do that, but every Christmas Eve, our family, consisting of 8 people, and that's what you need for a basic handbell choir, would play for the Christmas Eve service, and that was real unique to have all 8 people in one family performing in church. When I was in high school, well, before that, when we lived on Big Bend Road, there was a fine young lad, and his brother lived next door to us, so both of them were fine young lads at the time. But Roland Nicholson took a special interest in me, and they had a print shop built in their backyard in conjunction with their 2-car garage. Eventually they took that over. Their dad was an officer with the World Color Press printing company in town, printed millions of advertising inserts in newspapers and millions of comic books. And whenever they'd get a letterpress job, as they call it, they would have the 2 Nicholson brothers do this small work. And really taught me a lot about the printing business, hand setting of type, which they did in those days. And he also had a hobby. He had a little dirt track race car. Not a midget, but just a small dirt track race car. And when I used to see him putter with that, work on it, I acquired a deep interest in auto racing. And when I was in high school, Bill Myers and I, 1937, went to our first Indianapolis automobile race, which I did for several years, and then eventually, instead of going with Bill Myers, went with Bob Reed and Bill Widmer, and I forget who the others were, but probably 4 of us. And we went to 4 or 5 races, and then we all went into the service. And after the service, I started going back to the races. And when I got married, that ended that. And about 14 years ago, Margina and I went to our first time trials at Indianapolis. And we've been to many time trials. I think once we didn't go, once we went and were rained out, and one year we went and saw the race, but I still have a deep interest in the better type of auto racing, which is, of course, the Indianapolis 500-mile Speedway. And when I came home on leave after being overseas, I know my dad was always very much interested in masonry, belonged to a lodge up in Chicago, and belonged to the Scottish Rite and the Shrine. When he was in the Navy, he was a chief yeoman stationed at Great Lakes Naval Air Station, as chief yeoman. Had his name on over, I think it was 500 applications for the Scottish Rite, which probably is some kind of record. But he instilled in me during my growing up years an interest in masonry, and when I was home on leave, I had made arrangements to take my first degree in masonry up at the Webster Groves Lodge number 84. And then after coming back from my 30 days back at the ship, getting out of the service, I took my 2nd and 3rd degrees, followed by the 32nd degree in the Scottish Rite, and I joined the Shrine. I'm sorry to say that I'm not active in masonry anymore, even though I do still belong to the Blue Lodge here in Webster. What?
I want to know what you did between high school and the Navy.
Well, I went right out of high school to work with my dad in the real estate business. Got a good background from him because he was a good teacher. He was I said he was a chief yeoman. He knew, one of the few men in the whole world, I guess, that knew typing and shorthand back in those days, and that's what he taught in business college in Chicago before he went into the service, and what he taught in the St. Louis high schools when he got out of the service. And he developed his real estate business over the years, and I went with him when I graduated from high school. And he had gotten pretty much into the farm end of the real estate business. He sold many, many farms, and that got to be the biggest part of his real estate business. He sold residences here in the greater Webster Groves area, and still continued to do that after he started specializing in farms. Well, he opened an office out across the street from the original Diamonds out on Highway 66, and I managed that. It proved to be impractical. I was more of a help to him back here in Webster. Then on May the 5th, 1947, I had a chance to go with the real estate department of Webster Groves Trust Company, and I accepted that challenge, and with my dad's approval, and sold real estate for many years. And then back about 1973, Webster Groves Trust Company discontinued their real estate sales department, and I was the only one in the sales department that kept on at the bank. Everybody else left the bank, or their jobs were terminated at the bank. And I worked then in the real estate loan department, did all the bank appraising, and closed the real estate loans, real estate deals, Clayton and City of St. Louis, the City Hall down there, and county seats all around St. Louis County. And then the 1st of February 1985, just about 6 months before my 65th birthday, or retirement age, Ray Ruby, the president, asked me if I had thought of, well, this was actually a few months before that, asked me if I had thought about retiring, and even though I was that close to retiring, I had never given it a thought. And he explained that when Boatman's Bank took over the Webster Groves Trust Company on the 1st of February, that the retirement policies, the retirement pay was going to change. And he asked me if I wanted to retire 4 or 5 months early to take advantage of the Charter Bank retirement plan. I said that's a good idea. I retired with Warren Brusky, the bank president, and Sammy Sutton, who worked there for many years. I have certainly enjoyed my 7 years of retirement. I keep fairly busy. I work a heck of a lot of crossword puzzles, some 200 a month, I think, and work in my basement. Put a lot of time in the yard, got the greenest yard in the neighborhood, and in spite of many objections to buying good yard equipment, I get it anyway, and got a yard trimmer here a few weeks ago. It made all the difference in the world. The yard looks a lot better. About time for a new lawnmower and hedge trimmers and so forth. We need a new lawn boy, yard worker, I mean.
Lions Carnival and the parrot story of Floyd, Goat Hill Floyd. The Lions Carnival, when they took the stuff back and forth in your dad's.
Oh, I'm getting a lot of help from the sidelines. I mentioned we moved from Big Bend Road when I was 6 up to Woodlawn and Rock Hill. We had a side porch on that nice new house, which faced right on Rock Hill Road. And once in a while, my dad, who never stopped working, he was a workaholic, worked all day, every day, and evenings and holidays. Well, first let me explain that when we moved there, we got a parrot. And it went through the typical Polly wants a parrot routine and other things. And one Sunday afternoon that my dad did take off, he was sitting out on this side porch reading the Sunday newspaper, and the parrot was out there on his bar with a tray under it, of course. And here comes a convertible, or roadsters as we call them in those days, filled with pretty high school girls. And this parrot saw this car coming, and he went, "Hello, pretty girls, hello, pretty girls." And the girls turned around, all they could see was my dad sitting there. So my dad took the parrot to his office, which at the time was right at the intersection of Lockwood and Big Bend. There were 3 store buildings, and he had the one on the east right next to Wendell's filling station. And for several years, the Lions Club had their carnival, annual carnival, on the grounds of the Nerix Hall, the Catholic Girls High School, right across Lockwood and Big Bend from my dad's office. And my dad's office, whereas he only used the front third of this building, office, it left a real good storage space for all of the paraphernalia, the prizes, the spinning wheels, the number strips they'd put down on the board for the various booths in the back of my dad's office. And let's say the parrot was moved to the office, and every night for 4 nights at the before the opening of the carnival each night, there'd be many, many members walk in and out of this office, and every time they would pass this parrot, they'd say, "Go to hell, Floyd." And that bird heard a collective number, I guess, of maybe thousands of "Go to hell, Floyd" every time going in or going out before the carnival or later in the evening after the carnival. "Go to hell, Floyd." So the following Monday morning, when my dad came into the office, the bird said to him, "Go to hell, Floyd." And I always say the next day we had parrot stew for supper, but I don't think that's absolutely correct.
The canary that flew out the window.
Oh, yeah. My dad's hobby was raising canaries, and he had some real expensive canaries. And I remember back when I was a lad, he paid $50 for a canary. And $50 in those days was a lot of money, maybe $500 today. But this was a prize canary. And that was back in the days when people thought that they had to cover the canary's cage every night. I don't think they do that anymore. Somehow this very expensive bird got out of his cage, and this was in the middle of winter when temperature was down around 0, got out of the house, and of course my dad, if it couldn't stand a little draft at night and had to be covered, he knew that bird wasn't going to last 30 seconds out in this below 0 weather. 3 or 4 days later, a lady who lived 2 blocks north of us on Sherwood Drive called and said that she had heard that my dad had lost a real fine canary bird. And she said that last night her blind mother up in her bedroom heard a pecking on her window. Mother called the daughter came up to her room, opened the window, and the bird flew in. So when she heard that my dad had lost this bird, she called my dad and said, "I understand that you've lost a canary bird," and went on to tell him about how it pecked at her mother's window, and she opened it up. And she said, or he said to her on the phone, "Mrs. Schmid, that bird doesn't belong to me." And that's just the kind of guy my dad was.
I asked about what you did between high school and the Navy, and you mentioned real estate. I was interested in your work, the job you had at the ammunition plant. Is that a significant story?
When the war, or before the war broke out, I did go out to the Weldon Springs Weldon Springs Powder Company, Powder Works. I worked in a big office there where they kept records on the production of acid from which they made the TNT, or the powder. And then I worked there, I don't know, a year or so, and went down. A man who had worked for my dad in his early 20s, was working at this time that I was out at Weldon Springs, working for the construction company that was building the big new Naval Air Station at Lambert Field. The Navy had a hangar up there, and that's about all they had. But they enlarged it, moved it, enlarged it, put in hangars and dorms and bachelor officers' quarters, ground school, all the necessary buildings, great big gym and indoor pool. And he told my dad that the rumor around the offices out there when they were constructing was that anybody who went down to what was then the new courthouse down at 12th and Market, enlisted in the Navy, and would tell the officials in there that they would like to be stationed at Lambert Field, that's what would happen. So I went in there and told them I wanted to enlist and I'd like to be stationed at Lambert Field. Well, it just so happened that my good buddy Bud Wickman was in this same group, some 20, 25 of us being sworn in together. And the petty officer, after we were sworn in, would read this list of names, and he'd say, Jones, report to Great Lakes Naval Training Station, 1400, a couple days after that. Smith, report to Great Lakes, and Alexander, report to Great Lakes. Wickman, report to Lambert Field tomorrow at 1400. Davis, report to Lambert Field at 1400. So that's how I got to be at Lambert Field. Didn't go through boot camp, home every night. Wasn't on a duty watch. I mentioned I edited the newspaper out there, organized a male chorus. We did a lot of singing around town, and we eventually cut that down to a double quartet. And about that time, the music director, vocal music director at the University City School District, George Mickelson, enlisted, came out there, and of course he took over all the vocal music, but we still had our double quartet. We had a radio broadcast every week. We went to the Missouri Athletic Club, the big banquets there, and many, many requests for our services. We tied up a Navy station wagon pretty well. Spent a lot of time off the base. And when I went aboard ship, I organized a quartet. Weren't many chances to sing being aboard ship, but we did sing every Sunday morning for church. And I was instrumental in organizing this quartet, the Statesman we called it, after we got back from the service.
Esther Recklow.
Didn't I mention her?
Yeah.
I don't know, you didn't
did.
tell me much about her.
Yeah, well, I'll mention again the people that influenced my growing up more than others were my dad, of course, my scoutmaster, Doc Colgate, a cappella choir teacher who I sang with ever since grade school. Later, the a cappella choir, Esther Recklow did, and Hans Lemke, who helped me so much in the instrumental musical field. And Roland Nicholson, I mentioned him, helping me learn what little mechanics I know and learn about the letterpress printing business, and got me started in auto racing.
Can you talk about your mother and her death eventually?
My mother was one of, 9 kids, I guess. Her parents both came over from Ireland. They were Catholic, as I recall, or as I was told. I didn't know them. My grandmother died when my mother was young, and my grandfather married, and I think he must have married a Protestant because they became Protestant. She grew up Protestant. And like most sons and daughters, I think my mother was the world's greatest. Great cook, good mother, a little bit of an artist. Every letter she'd write to me, whether down at Irondale or in the Navy, she'd put little caricatures on, little cartoons or whatever. And she was ill when I was at Lambert Field. And when I left Lambert Field, I'm digressing, left Lambert Field, I went to the Naval Ground School at Iowa University at Iowa City. I was there for about 6 months and transferred to what they call Ship's Pool in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island. And the Ship's Pool, I'll say while I'm here, they would draw rates out of the ship's pool to man a new ship just being put into commission. So many yeomen, so many gunner's mates, so many radiomen, so many medics and so forth. And then from that pool, from that nucleus, they would build a full crew for the new ship. While I was there, my mother became quite ill, and I got emergency leave to go home. And it looked like she was going to pull through, and I went back. I got as far as New York City, where I stopped to visit a cousin and his wife. He was skipper on a little Navy sub-chaser. And while I was there, his mother, my aunt, called him and said that my mother had passed away. This was June 22nd, 1944. So I called my ship, talked to the exec, and he said, "We'll go back home for the funeral," which I did. And then I went right back to the ship. In fact, when I left to go home on the original leave, I left from Newport, and during that time while I was home, the crew transferred to this new ship in the Philadelphia Navy Yard. And I got back in time to go out on the shakedown, went down to Norfolk, Virginia, where they test all the equipment, the guns and so forth, the engines and the radio equipment. Then when they get back to the Navy Yard, they correct all those things, maybe make some changes in their design and so forth. And then we were there a month or so. Then in August, we left to go down through the Caribbean to the Panama Canal and then out west to the South Pacific. We had quite an elaborate shellback experience. Shellback, what do they call it, Monty? You went through it. Anyway, initiation. That's where you cross the equator for the first time. And the type of ship we had a great big, what we called a fantail, a couple 100 feet long, made a wonderful area for us to have our recreation, and certainly a wonderful area for us to have our shellback initiation. Had all kinds of torture equipment and a big pool filled with salt water on this thing. Being a yeoman and having special privileges aboard ship, the skipper saw to that. No, none of his yeomen loaded gear, none of them carried mail, no real hard work at all. So when it came time for the shellback initiation, whereas they couldn't put every sailor through all of the torture machines and so forth, they made sure that all yeomen got the full work. So I made up for the fact that I didn't have to carry stores or mail or anything else. But that was very interesting, and I certainly enjoyed it. And we went to, we passed Guadalcanal, passed, we had to go into Lai, New Guinea. We didn't go ashore there. From there we went up to Manus and the Admiralty Islands and over to the west end of New Guinea, up to, can't think what the little island was, where we picked up our flag, our admiral and his staff, where we were a flagship, Comair 7. And we went back to Manus. No, that wasn't the name of the house, the supply base in, anyway. We went to Leyte in the Philippines about 2 days after the initial invasion of the Philippines. We had kamikazes falling around us, and none of them ever hit us, fortunately. We did take some personnel bombs, which were just fragments of shrapnel. They weren't meant to sink a ship, just injure sailors. And we spent most of our time at various ports and islands around the Philippines. We were in the invasion of Lingayen, which is the largest of the Philippine islands. That's the island where Manila is, and Clark Field, and Subic Bay, Manny, and of course it's the island where Manila Bay is. And after participating in the Lingayen Gulf invasion, we left there and went down to Subic Bay and then directly into Manila Bay. Had to go past Corregidor. They were still fighting the Japs, shooting the flamethrowers up at the Japs. The Manila Bay was filled with some, I'm going to guess, 30 sunken Japanese ships. That was quite an impressive sight. Of course, as far as the Japs were concerned, the war was over, but they didn't know it, continued to fight. And we moored at what you might call a suburb of Manila, in the southern part of Manila Bay, at a town called Cavite. There had been a big U.S. naval submarine base there before the war. The Japs took it over. Of course, they wrecked it. And there were a couple of tremendous, I think 3, for those days, very tall radio towers. And we had liberty up in the outskirts of Manila. And as we drove by rode by so many of these sunken ships, we saw a lot of Japanese sailors in their dress blues, or whatever they call them, hanging by the neck from an overhead. They would rather commit suicide than be taken by the American troops. That was their religion, of course, in their religion. And it didn't smell like a floral shop. And we saw, well, I shouldn't go into that, bloated bodies floating in the water, and men that had been shot and left for several days in the hot sun. But that's the kind of stuff you like to forget.
Talk about liberty in Cavite, how the Filipino people felt about the Americans.
Oh, I guess they felt all right. I didn't notice any animosity.
No, they weren't they didn't welcome the Americans back.
Oh, I think they did. What bugged me was seeing so many eligible young men walking around as civilians, and here we were over there fighting their war, getting killed for them, and they weren't even in their own army.
What about the base?
The what?
The base.
I wish we could pan this camera.
Not here, it's in the other room.
We'll get it later.
After the war ended, I said they used our ship in this battle fleet to make sure all these individual Japanese commanders surrendered. And our first stop after leaving Subic Bay, which was our second visit to Subic Bay, to join this fleet was at the island of Okinawa, which had been dominated by the Japanese for many years. And the Okinawans, I don't know if they still do, but they had for many, many years, hundreds, maybe thousands of years, had a burial custom where they would inter the body of a dead person for 1 year, after which time they would disinter the body or dig it up. And the youngest girl, if I remember the story correctly, the youngest girl in the family of that deceased person had the job of scraping off all of the remaining flesh and hair and everything from these bones. They would grind up the bones, except for the skull, and put them in an urn about 14 inches high, baked tile, clay. Now this all leads up to the fact that part of this custom was to dig rooms or cells in the side of a hill. Oh, they must have been about 14 feet long, about 10 feet deep, and maybe 6 feet high. And the only entrance to each one of these cells was a doorway about 2 feet wide and about 3 feet high, and the walls were about 20 inches thick. Well, these burial locations made wonderful places for the Japanese to get in there and shoot out of their little the doorways. There's room for them. Oh, I didn't mention, just as soon as you went through this wall, through the opening, the only floor was the full width of this, what did I say, 14-foot room, and about 2 feet wide. That's all the floor there was. And the rest of the room consisted of stone steps, smooth stone steps. And there were 12 of those, like display shelves in a store. So after this body was dug up, bones ground up, or first the bones were cleaned, they would put the bones in one of these urns. They were, of course, handmade, had designs on them, and for some reason they had a few holes in the sides. And they would put this urn up, up on top of this first step. Of course, the body had been dead for a year by that time. And at the end of the second year, then, they would graduate that urn to the next step, and the next and the next. So at the end of 13 years, the urn was on the top step. I didn't mention that they put the skull on top of each one of these urns. They didn't grind it up. So at the end of 13 years, including the year in the ground, this person's soul was in heaven. Well, when the Japanese got in there, they had no respect for the rituals or beliefs or practices of the Okinawan people, and they would just knock these things around to make sure that, or if you give themselves enough room to shoot at the Americans as they landed out of these little openings. So one afternoon when we were at Okinawa, and the only reason we went there, remind me of the typhoon. There had been a typhoon a few days before we got there. We were actually on our way to Incheon, Korea. We went through this typhoon, we got out of it, and we were ordered then to go to Okinawa to blow up the ships, not the ships, but the PBMs, the type that we tended. And while we were there, Lyman Rooney, Anthony Buglioni, as you can tell by the name, he wasn't Irish, and I went on liberty over on the beach. And we walked back into the countryside, and we came to one of these burial rooms, and we peeked in, and I found an urn that had been knocked over and was empty. So I knew that wasn't any good to anybody, so I commented to my two buddies that, boy, I'd sure like to have that urn at home, make a lamp out of it. But I'm not going to carry that thing all over this island all afternoon. And this little Italian friend of mine, Tony Buglioni, we called him, so well, I'll take that. And I said, no. If I can't do it, if I'm not going to do it, I don't want you to do it. Oh, yeah. And I might interject here that the truest, most loyal friends I had in the Navy, I think, were my Italian friends. That might be a coincidence, but I had quite a few of them. And certainly this Buglioni lad was one of them. So we got back to the ship, and he still had this urn. I took it down one deck to my office, one deck below main deck, put it alongside my desk. And many times I'd look at that thing sitting there, and I'd say, I think next time I go up to the deck, I'll take it up and throw it overboard. Because I didn't know how I was going to get it home from San Francisco to St. Louis. But I never think to take it up. And then frequently when I was up on top side, I'd say, well, if I'd had that urn, I'd throw it overboard. But I didn't make connections either way, so when I got back to San Francisco, that urn was still sitting alongside my desk, so I decided to send it home. And of course that was back before the days when I had any tools or any know-how about using the tools. And George Blanner Electric Company up in Webster, specialized in making lamps out of anything you wanted, rifles, horns, anything. So I found that out at a Lions Club meeting, and I said, George, I've got this ancient Okinawan urn. Could you make a lamp out of it for me? And he said he would do that, be glad to. So he made it, and I have it, and I've had it ever since, and it's been in our living room up until a few days ago. I don't know where it is now, but that's one of my prized possessions, certainly the best thing I brought back from overseas. Well, I mentioned the typhoon. We had a hotshot skipper, fine man, but there were so many officers, especially in the service, who were in their glory. They had more in the service, more privileges, more money, more power, more authority than they ever had on the outside. Is that right, Monty? And they met, some of them, not all of them, but some of them really lived that up. And we had such a skipper. When we were en route from Subic Bay in the Philippines to Incheon, Korea, we went through this typhoon that I mentioned. And he was SOPA. We had, I think, a fleet of 5 ships. And he was SOPA, Senior Officer Present Afloat. He was in charge of all these things. Being a seaplane tender, we were a complete weather department. We had all the existing weather equipment in those days because we had to, just like any airport, had to give weather information to the 18 plane crews that we serviced. Consequently, he knew very well from our aerology department, as we called it, that we were heading right for this typhoon, right for the eye of the typhoon. But he wanted to be able to tell his grandkids that he had taken 5 ships right through the center of a typhoon. He should have been court-martialed for such a stupid thing. Well, these couple destroyers, they were bobbing around like corks. Waves were 60 feet high and 130-mile-an-hour winds, 150-mile-an-hour winds, I think. And our big ship, being top-heavy with 2 great big cranes on the top, really rolled. Some of the boys would get one of the expansion joints and just watch those things give and take. The darn ship could have cracked in 2 at any time. But fortunately, being prone to wooziness or outright seasickness, I was able to spend 3 days in my bunk, which was a cot I'd put up every night in my office. I wasn't back in the crew's quarters. So I didn't get sick. I got woozy, but I didn't get sick.
So
Lost a little weight.
the ship would go from side to side.
I just said that. The ship was top-heavy and would roll from side to side. And if it had rolled just a few more degrees either side, it would have gone all the way over, we were told. And we had to head into the storm, into the wind, I think, at 4 knots. Fortunately, we were going in the proper direction. But if we had stopped or hadn't headed into the wind and the waves would have rolled us over. But that's being in a typhoon or tornado or hurricane aboard ship on the water, of course, is a lot different than being in one of those things on the dry land where you don't bounce up and down and you don't stand a chance of losing your ship under you.
Ed Doisy.
When I joined, isn't this getting too much money? When I joined the Scouts, back in the days when you had to be 12, not 11, I joined the same night that Ed Doisy joined. We joined together and we were close buddies for the rest of our lives ever since that time. We learned a lot about Indian lore, Indian dancing. We were in the band, music together, the high school a cappella choir. We were good buddies, very close friends until he died. He sang bass, perfect pitch in our Statesman Quartet. We never used a pitch pipe or a piano or anything to give us our pitch. And
He was a doctor.
he went to medical school, to Harvard Medical School when he was in the Army and finished up after he got out of the Army, still in the Army program. Came to St. Louis. His dad, of course, was Dr. Edward E. Doisy Sr., who won the Nobel Prize back in 1941 for isolating vitamin K and working with estrogen and other female problems. Ed Doisy, Dr. Doisy, was the best man at our wedding, my closest friend up until the time he died, and did a lot of camping together. He was very avid outdoorsman. He loved to fish and hunt, which I didn't do. We did do some fishing every opening day, first day of March every year. Our quartet and our wives for quite a few years went down to a trout hatchery and fished as a group. Had a lot of fun doing that.
Charlie Manise.
Another very important person in my life whom I met through Romondo, was Charlie Manise, one of the country's leading authorities on big band and jazz. Monty was his engineer, Monty being a communications student at University of Missouri, St. Louis, was fortunate to be Charlie Manise's engineer when Charlie had his weekly, 3-hour program on KWMU.
8 hours.
8 hour?
5 to 1.
I don't remember that. Monty says 8 hour every Saturday night. But Monty, besides some background in big band music he received at home when he was growing up, had a tremendous background and fortunate to work with Charlie. Then when Charlie went with KMOX, had his Saturday night show, Monty took over Charlie's show on KWMU and did an excellent job. Big band music, to me, has been very important all of my life, and I love it, and I know quite a bit about big bands,
Your
fortunately.
record collection.
I had some 2,078 records, and then when LPs came out, I got some of those. We were raising a family at the time and couldn't afford too many LP records. And then I went into the stereo and the CDs and VCR and television, of course. And we have quite a bit of equipment, not the best in the world, but it's adequate, I think. And music has been a big part of my life, and probably I've made more and better friends through music than any other aspect of my life. And there was a time when I was a Boy Scout, we'd be playing a game out in the churchyard, met at the Webster Groves, or the Emmanuel Episcopal Church up at Bompart and Lockwood. And part of each of our meetings was playing a game, besides the other things Doc would teach us and drill us in. But I think this particular time we were getting ready to go on a camp out of some kind, and Mrs. Schiffman brought her 2 boys, John and Julius Schiffman, down to the church, as did all the parents bring their boys. And these 2 boys I looked up to more than anybody else in the troop. They were very outstanding boys, older than me. And this day, particular day, when Mrs. Schiffman brought the boys down, they brought down their little tomboy sister who was about 3 or 4 years old. And while we were loading the cars and so forth, she was running around getting in trouble, getting in the way and causing havoc. And then I don't know how many years later, I married the same little 3 or 4 year old girl. And we've lived happily, or I have anyway, lived happily ever after.
Are there any memories in between those 2 dates of her? When you...
I didn't know much about her when I was, from that time on till after the war, I guess. Before the war, we had at the Webster Groves Christian Church up here a citywide, it was supposed to be a church Christian endeavor group, but it was so popular, and so many good kids belonged to it, it became a citywide young people's group. Catholics, Jews, Disciples of Christ, Methodists, everybody belonged to it. And that was a big part of my life until the war. Of course, after the war, we tried to get together again, but didn't do it. We were all older then. And CE every Sunday night we looked forward to that.
You're talking about John and Julie, hanging out with John and Julia.
Yeah, they, of course, were active in that. That's one reason I was attracted to that organization in the first place.
The name. Yes.
Huh?
John and Julius.
Speak up. John and Julius, yeah. Schiffman. They were Mrs. Schiffman's boys. And as I said, May the 1st, 1947, little Shifty and I were married.
When? November the 1st.
What did I say?
May.
Yeah, November the 1st, 1947. Oh. Oh. I'm looking at this montage here. Oh, yeah.
Still isn't so much about the kids.
Getting back to the bottle band, Plymouth Junior High School, which was brand new when Catherine started there, 7th grade, every year would have an annual spring talent show. Catherine went there the first year. Karen, of course, went there the second year, and either in the 7th or 8th grade, for this talent show, Karen asked me if I would help her with some kind of act. So I suggested she get 7 of her friends and we'd work up one of these bottle bands, which of course was the head of the talent show. It just so happened that Phyllis Diller, who at the time lived in Webster Groves, just a few blocks away from Plymouth Junior High School, had a daughter in the school, and the daughter did something in the show, I don't remember what it was, but Phyllis came to see the talent show. And that's back when she, I guess, was in her prime or just becoming popular. And she was connected with Channel 5. I don't think she had a show, but being in show business, she knew everybody back there, down there. And when she heard our bottle band, she contacted, I can't think of his name, a young man who had a high school dance hop type program. American bandstand type.
Russ Carter.
Russ Carter was, that's right. She told Russ Carter about this group and how much she liked them, so Russ called me and asked them to come in. We played, I mentioned before, on Pepsi-Cola bottles. And because Uncle John was a big part of the Pepsi-Cola company in those days, he got us all these brand new bottles, and we plugged Pepsi on this show. And we were on, in fact, during the Pepsi-Cola commercial on one of these dance shows. Then after the show, they took all of us out to a nice Italian restaurant on the hill and gave us a nice feed. And they gave us something else, I've forgotten what.
Pepsi?
Oh, a couple of cases of Pepsi, yeah. Big deal. But we had a lot of fun with those bottle bands, and it was quite a unique idea. But always music, always music.
What's your favorite food?
I think my favorite food is fresh peaches on ice cream, vanilla ice cream. I like spaghetti. There are very few foods that I don't like.
What's your...
Let me say this. I mentioned before, I think several times, that I hated the food in China. So much so that we've been back now 2 or 3 months and we have not been to a Chinese restaurant. We used to go maybe once a month before that. I think eventually we'll get back to the local Chinese restaurants, and there's absolutely no comparison between the garbage you get in China and the good food you get here in our Chinese restaurants.
What's your favorite color?
Oh, when I was a lad, 9 years old, I had a electric train, and it was a dark green, but I liked very much. And ever since then, I guess that color green has been my favorite color, even though my initials spell red.
You don't like purple?
I don't like purple, particularly. But I plan to continue to enjoy life, enjoy my retirement, my years left with my lovely wife, and enjoy traveling, blacksmithing, woodwork,
Visiting.
yard work. We visit in our travels. We visit our kids in Kansas City, once in a while in Denver. A couple times we've been out to western Montana. A couple times we've been up to Belvedere, Illinois to visit John. I don't think John will ever get married. He has a lady friend, but...
Do you have any particular memories of baseball in St. Louis?
Oh yeah, I grew up in the days of the Gas House Gang, which was very well known around the world in those days. Some great ball players back when the Yankees were so good, and the Cardinals had a very unique team that played together and worked together, and that's why they called them the Gas House Gang. They were so closely knit. And I could mention a lot of old-time ball players that I've seen that weren't even on the Cardinal team that came here. And of course, I remember the St. Louis Browns, the perpetual losers, but St. Louis Browns had more dedicated, devoted fans in spite of their continuing losses, I guess, at one time than the Cardinals did. I used to say all the Brownie fans were going to have a convention in a phone booth someday, and the battle cry of the Browns each year was, "Wait till next year, we'll show 'em." But in 1943, was it? Browns did win the American League pennant and played the Cardinals in the World Series. As I recall, they lost to the Cardinals, but at least they... Yeah, that's right, they lost. And...
Do you remember me getting the Cardinals autographs after a game?
I think so, back in the hallway.
What about the pets?
Dogs? Family dogs?
Oh, I say the Browns later became, in St. Louis, they became the Baltimore Orioles. Pets, yes, we always, when I was growing up, always had a pet. One I remember best was Patsy, a little white French bulldog. He was my good buddy. Had several litters of pups. She had a hair lip. You couldn't nurse. Oh no, that was one of her pups. And we fortunately caught this pup before it starved to death because it couldn't nurse with a cleft palate. And we fed it with a baby bottle and an eyedropper, fed it cod liver oil.
About snakes and pets that the kids had.
Huh?
Wrong number.
Kids had a lot of pets, and John snakes. And
Yeah, our kids usually had a pet or two around, various dogs. And we just, about a year and a half ago, we acquired our first cat, which we've enjoyed quite a bit. But when I was a lad, we had 2 billy goats and guinea pigs and dogs, horses.
Not the horses that were poisoned.
Yeah. The Ozark Theater one year had some kind of contest, and the prize was a pony. And the family up at the corner of Maple and Swan won the pony. They had no knowledge of horses, no provisions for taking care of it. It was undernourished and so badly abused and mistreated that it went blind. And my dad heard about it and went right over there. Instead of calling the Humane Society and the police, he went over and asked the family if he could have the pony, and they said yes, so he brought it back. And my dad got that for Mary Jane, my sister. And we had a crackpot bachelor. I can have another word for it that sounds like bachelor. A letter carrier, an old codger lived behind us. He hated the whole world. He hated our horses. And we feel sure that he poisoned this pony Billy one day and woke up in the morning and she was over on her side. But we enjoyed the few years we had our horses. And Fred Holcamp, one of the Holcamp Lumber Company brothers, had some of the best show horses in the United States and was, until he died, one of the best show horse judges. He had a big, beautiful horse farm down at Hillsboro. And he was like a brother to my dad. We lived just half a block apart on Sherwood Drive. And besides going to these Wild West shows, as I mentioned earlier, we would always go to the National Horse Show held in St. Louis every year, and we would see some beautiful horses there, some of which belonged to Fred Holcamp. And they brought these horses in from all over the North America, I guess. And apparently Fred Holcamp liked the way I rode, handled horses, and he wanted me to ride one of his horses. I was about 9 or 10 years old, I guess. One of his smaller horses in the horse show. But because my mother had seen several bad falls, whereas the walls, the fences that go around the horse show ring, full length and width of the arena, they were slanted in slightly, and a horse would step on that, hit that sloping fence, and trip. His legs would go out from under him. And she had seen some bad falls and didn't want me as a 9-year-old to take one of those falls, so she wouldn't let me ride a national horse show. If she could have seen me ride Roman style on those two crazy runaway horses, she might have thought differently about riding in a horse show. Out of words.
Not much about your family, though.
Well, you want me to go into?
I don't know.
No.
Gee, I had a good one.
Where we lived, or?
Oh, I wanted to ask you your thoughts on living in Webster Groves.
I am so rabidly fanatical about living in Webster Groves that when I got with my friends who were from out of town or when I was in the Navy, I'm sure I made them sick and tired of hearing me talk about Webster Groves. I don't ever want to leave it, except when they haul me out in the big black wagon. And it's just a wonderful town. It's strictly a residential community, a wonderful family city, excellent schools, parks, excellent spirit, good neighbors, good people that are attracted to Webster, I think. The community of almost entirely homeowners, not that renters aren't good people, but they just don't take the pride that homeowners have in maintaining their properties and participating in the various functions of the city. And when we were younger, you want me to toot my horn, we were very active in the Avery School PTA, as you probably remember. I became president of it, became president of the Plymouth Junior High School PTA. Did I mention what I did in the Red Cross?
Yeah, were you in the Lions Club program chair?
I was program chairman for 43 years, secretary for 26 years
In the Lions.
in the Lions Club in Webster. And I have known the club since I was 5 years old, because that's how old that's how old I was when my dad joined as a charter member on March the 12th, 1925. And so I got a good background in Lions Club long before I joined.
Talk about this house.
Well, I got to know this house originally because I went with a girl, first girl I ever went with, in fact, lived in this house, Betty Sue Aiken, who was part of the Christian Endeavor up the street, and one of the reasons, or the main reason, I guess, I went to Christian Endeavor and joined that church, sang in the choir. So I got to know it when I went with her, and then she and her sister got married and moved out, and some years later her mother got too old to live in the house, and they listed the property with me when I worked at the bank, and told Margene, asked her if she'd like to live here, and she decided she would, and we bought the house and moved in here August 28th, 1952, just before you were born, a couple months, 6-8 months. And I have been thrilled to death here. I think it's a wonderful place, not big, not pretentious, but certainly is a homey place, and it meets all of our needs. And we've improved the house, certainly.
How?
We had several new furnaces. We had new siding put on. Of course, before that we had it painted, or I painted it several times.
Hello? Yeah? Okay. Yeah? No. Recording Grandpa. Are you all right? Okay, I'll call you in a few minutes.
I could whistle Dixie, not down Dixie, Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Okay, all right. Okay. I got it. Okay, thanks. I'll be there in about 5 minutes. Bye. I gotta get home. Deb's gotta be someplace to babysit
Okay.
in about, I have to leave right now. I'm not even gonna put the stuff back.
And
Okay.
so mote it be.
And you love cold knee drag, or whatever it is.
Oh yes, I like Jewish music very much, and Kol Nidre, Eli Eli, and other Jewish numbers.
But you're not Jewish.
That's what they tell me.
Well, say it.
I'm not, well, that's not, don't say anything derogatory like that. No, I'm not Jewish. But we could go into the other side of the family.